moi.
Welcome to Disturbing Ideas. I'm Pat Boyle. Each week I present an idea that is indisputably true, but which is seldom discussed candidly anywhere else because it makes some people uncomfortable. This week's topic is the Tuskegee Airmen and the movie Red Tails. There are some mysteries surrounding this group, but I will try to stick with the verifiable facts. There are a couple of points that I think are true, but which I can't confirm. Even so, I expect that most of you will be surprised. The real history is much different from the movie. George Lucas lost his shirt on Red Tails. Fortunately, he has a lot of shirts. Red Tails was rated rotten by the movie review site Rotten Tomatoes. Only 40% of the reviewers liked it. Most thought it was predictable and preachy. Some disliked the CGI effects. So why am I bothering with flogging a movie which lost money and was an artistic failure? Most movies are bad history, even if the producers mean well. For example, in Mel Gibson's Braveheart, the Battle of Stirling Bridge had no bridge. They'd run out of money for the bridge. But Lucas didn't just get the details wrong in Red Tails. He set out specifically and deliberately to distort and deceive. The whole Tuskegee Airmen subject is about racial prejudice. Lucas tells his tale in terms of blacks overcoming objections from whites. Why, you may ask, were those white officers so reluctant to admit blacks? Maybe they were simple bigots. Or maybe they understood the record of black units in the Army. Maybe it was a desire for self-preservation. In the movie The Caine Mutiny, the titles announce that the movie is fiction because there has never been a real mutiny in the U.S. Navy. Not quite true. There was a mutiny on a U.S. naval ship in 1842 that resulted in 3 hangings, all white sailors. Other than that, there have been no U.S. naval mutinies. But there have been many large-scale mutinies in the U.S. Army. They all seem to have involved blacks. Wikipedia lists no white mutinies in the U.S. Army at all, but it lists 13 Army mutinies that involved African Americans. Well, let me repeat. No white units have ever mutinied, but black units mutinied regularly. And these were not the antiseptic mutinies like in Mutiny on the Bounty, where the mutineers killed no one and no one was hung by the authorities. For example, in the Pacific theater of World War II, blacks in 1945 protested their white officers at Townsville Base in Australia by firing 700 machine gun rounds into the officers' tents. This incident was only recently uncovered because it had been hidden by then Congressman Lyndon Johnson. Who knows how many other incidents have been hushed up? There was also the Brooklyn Field Mutiny of 1944, where blacks shot white officers for 2 hours, or the Camp Claiborne Mutiny of 1944, where 14 blacks were court-martialed for shooting at their white officers. One got the death penalty. In the Dale Mowbray Field Mutiny of 1945, 5 blacks were sentenced to 13 to 15 years. In the Fort Lawton Mutiny near Seattle in 1944, there were 45 arrested and 28 convicted, all blacks. In the movie The Red Tails, Lightning spends a night in jail because he punched out one of the white officers over access to the officers' club. The Tuskegee Airmen bomber pilots had much the same sort of altercation in real life, except that 162 black airmen were arrested. There had been a similar black troop mutiny in the First World War when the mutineers marched on Houston. 19 blacks were hung. There is evidence for many other mutinies that has been hushed up. Wikipedia doesn't even list the deadly Camp Van Horn mutiny or the Guam race riot. I've seen at least 3 movies based on the Mutiny on the Bounty with Clark Gable, Marlon Brando, and Mel Gibson as the main mutineer. But I have yet to see a movie based on any of these many black mutinies. There were no World War II mutineers who looked like Gable, Brando, or Gibson. They all looked more like Denzel Washington. In the late 20s, it was the Army Air Corps policy not to have black pilots. An official document at the time said blacks had smaller brains, lower IQs, and they were inferior. That was nearly a century ago now. What do we know now? Well, blacks indeed have smaller brains and lower IQs. Presumably, the Air Force meant they were inferior as pilots. That, however, isn't true. Blacks, as we will see later, have certain genetic advantages as fighter pilots. But we also see that for a program like the Tuskegee Airmen, that didn't matter, nor did their lower intelligence. This is a subtle point that movies and books don't quite grasp. We'll tackle it later. The Army Air Corps exhibited prejudice against another group of would-be pilots. These men were segregated, treated harshly, disrespected, and even persecuted. The Army Air Corps and the Air Force it later evolved into has always connected flying a fixed-wing warplane with being an officer. Other nations have non-commissioned pilots, but not our Air Force. All the Tuskegee Airmen fighter pilots were college graduates and officers. In World War II, we too had non-commissioned pilots. These were called the flying sergeants. Our Air Corps was then highly class conscious as well as race conscious. This program was abolished with the Flight Officer Act of 1942, but not before they had had 17 of their pilots become aces. Let me remind you that the Tuskegee Airmen never had a single ace. Now let's talk about equipment. In Lucas's movie, they show black pilots being bitter about having to fly what they called hand-me-down airplanes.
We're given hand-me-down planes.
We're losing them! I feel like I'm flying my grandfather's Buick.
Hoping that we would just limp along and go away.
This was when they were bombing and strafing Pantelleria in P-40s. At one point, one of the black pilots refers to his P-40 as his father's old Buick. There is no comparable scene in the much better HBO movie. Lucas is desperate to show white discrimination. But this is silly. P-40s were very successful planes in World War II. These were the planes used by the Flying Tigers. We made and deployed P-40s throughout the war, right up till VE Day. But the P-40s, of course, were no match at altitude for the German fighters. The bomber escorts had to fly above 18,000 feet, where no P-40 could hope to match a Bf-109. But the P-40 was an exceptional ground attack fighter because they were so fast at low altitude, very maneuverable, and tough. How low? The Tuskegee Airmen flew to Pantelleria at 25 feet. No high altitude fighting there. Hitting trees was the consideration. And most of the many P-40s in Italy by this time were flown by white pilots. We know that white pilots flew P-40s because political critics of the Tuskegee program undertook a study that compared the black and the white pilots. There were at least 3 separate Air Force studies of the Tuskegee Airmen. This was the one that was favorable to the black pilots. The critics expected the white pilots were more effective, but they weren't. The Tuskegee Airmen were just as good in the P-40s as the white pilots. At that time, in that place, the P-40 was the right plane for that job. The racism innuendo is in George Lucas's imagination. The Tuskegee Airmen always had good equipment. In this section, we'll introduce the close support mystery. Some of this is a little speculative. Many details have been buried or covered up. I'll try to give enough facts for you to draw your own conclusions. Most of the myths and legends about the Tuskegee Airmen revolve around the policies of close bomber escort support versus loose support. In the Red Tails movie, Gerald McCraney plays a fictional American General Luntz, who tearfully begs Terrence Howard, the fictional Colonel Bullard of the Tuskegee Airmen, to help him because he's losing so many bomber crews.
Colonel, I'll give it to you straight. I can't afford the kind of losses my bombers have been suffering.
Do you have film of the air cover your bombers are getting now, sir?
We need to change the way we fight. I need pilots who will fly close and tight to the heavies all the way. Not put my men in harm's way by chasing rabbits.
So you're asking me to tell my men not to shoot down Jerry fighters?
I'm asking them to put the bombers ahead of themselves. I don't care if they never splash another Jerry fighter. I need to get my heavies to the target and back.
The losses from enemy air, I believe my men can get that down, sir.
If you can bring back one or two more of my planes every mission.
Sir, I believe we can cut your losses by 70 or 80%.
Colonel, the word is you're arrogant.
If arrogant is the only word people use to describe me now, I would say I think I'm making progress.
Can you help us? I am asking you man to man. Can you help save lives?
The reason he claims is because those irresponsible white escort pilots keep flying off pursuing glory in dogfights, rather than staying near the bombers where they belong. This cowardly and irresponsible white pilot behavior is also shown in the opening scene behind the credits. The facts are just the opposite. The Tuskegee Airmen were withdrawn from action by General Hap Arnold, acting on another of the many Air Corps reports, this one in September 1943, about air indiscipline by the Tuskegee Airmen. The airmen were tasked with protecting American ground troops from attacking Nazi bombers. Instead, they flew off after the fighter escorts in an effort to get individual kills. Now, generals don't beg colonels for help with weepy eyes. It seems like this destroyed any verisimilitude that the movie might have had. The HBO TV movie is much less heavy-handed. We know, in fact, where the close escort policy came from. It was invented by Gerald Ira Aker in 1942. He was the architect of American daylight bombing. He originally believed that B-17s and B-24s didn't really need fighter escort at all. The British heavy bombers carried only 8 .30 caliber machine guns, but the B-17s that we flew carried 13 .50 caliber guns. Flying in a box formation, he and others thought that our bombers could defend themselves with overlapping fields of fire. The only place our bombers were vulnerable was from above directly in front, the so-called 12 o'clock high position. But he was wrong. Close escorting was a disaster. He thought our P-47 and P-38 fighters could mass around the bombers and cross into Germany. The German fighters, he thought, would come up to engage our fighters would prevail in the dogfights. And then when the fighters had to go back because of fuel shortages, the bombers would continue on unopposed to the target bases deep in Germany. But the damn Germans refused to cooperate. They didn't engage our fighters. They just waited for them to run low on fuel and turn back. Then they decimated our unescorted bombers. The climax of this disastrous policy were the two Schweinfurt raids in mid-1943. In the first one, we lost 60 bombers. In the second, we lost 77. We lost well over 1,000 flyers and air crew in those 2 days. We stopped bombing altogether for 5 months. It looked like daylight bombing was a total failure. Then we got new leadership under Generals Toohey Spates and Jimmy Doolittle. On January 21st, 1944, they changed the escort policy. Under Akers rules, the fighters had to stay above 18,000 feet, close to the bombers. Under the new policy, fighters were free to follow the Nazi planes all the way down to the ground. They also actively hunted for German fighters wherever they might be. The movie gets everything backwards. It was abandoning the close escort policy that turned things around, and it certainly didn't originate with some obscure black group leader. Before 12144, the white pilots wanted to pursue, but they couldn't because they were disciplined. They were not self-indulgent and out of control the way the movie contends. The movie just tries to defame whites so as to promote blacks. By the time the Tuskegee Airmen were assigned to bomber escort, close escorting was no longer the preferred policy. When the escort policy was to stay close, the enemy fighters had taken advantage of the U.S. fighters' reluctance to pursue them. The Nazis were over their own territory. They attacked our bombers, disengaged, landed, refueled, rearmed, and then they flew back up to reattack. When we changed policy, our fighters followed them down and killed them when they were trying to land or on the ground. This was how our propeller-driven fighters were later able to destroy the faster Nazi jets. The Tuskegee Airmen, however, continued with the close escort policy after all the white units had been set free. Why was this? That's the mystery. The problem with understanding all this is that there have been so many celebratory myths invented about this one unit just because it was black. Everything is buried under layers of propaganda. The movie The Red Tails and the HBO movie attribute the fact that the black pilots stuck with the bombers as a policy of their black colonel, Benjamin O. Davis. Davis is shown in both movies as being an effective advocate before the U.S. Congress. He was the political voice of the Tuskegee Airmen. So, if he was effective in Washington politics, maybe the close escort policy that the black group, and only the black group, followed was a political, not a military decision. That would account for several known facts. First of all, the Tuskegee Airmen shot down very few German fighters. They downed less than half as many Bf-109s and FW-190s as did white units also equipped with P-51s. In another Air Corps investigation, the report on the Tuskegee group was that they were strongly criticized for their very low kill rate. That's why they never had an ace when the other white groups in P-51s had many. But that must be balanced against their better than average record on protecting the fighters they were escorting. The HBO movie ends with a graphic that perpetuates the crazy myth that the Tuskegee Airmen never lost a bomber. They lost, in fact, about 25. That's hardly zero, but it's almost twice as good as the white escort unit record. They were very effective escort pilots from the bomber's point of view. The bomber pilots knew that, and the red tails became popular. That part of the legend is true enough. But there is much more to the story than that. The Nazis weren't fools. Fighter sweeps alone failed to bring up the German fighters. In early 1944, the Nazis were losing a war of attrition. They had fewer and fewer pilots and planes. U.S. bombers were destroying German airplane factories, and they couldn't afford to lose more planes and pilots in dogfights with U.S. fighters. So Doolittle exposed the bombers. He used the bombers as bait. The Nazis had to engage our bombers, which exposed their fighters and made it possible for our fighters to destroy them, which they did. Abandoning close support brought the Nazi fighters up. U.S. bomber pilots didn't like being exposed to German fighters. They liked the close support tactics that by this period only black pilots were using. But being safe wasn't their job. Doolittle and Spates were running out of time in early 1944. D-Day was approaching, and they had to get the Nazi fighters out of the skies before our troops hit the beaches at Normandy. Nazi fighters over Omaha Beach couldn't be tolerated. The generals were making some very tough decisions, trading aircrew lives for infantry lives in the future. Black pilots entered the war too late for the major aerial conflict. At Casablanca in 1942, the Allied High Command issued what was called the PointBlack Directive. They made strategic bombing of the Nazi aircraft industry a first priority. We needed to clear the skies of Nazi warplanes before D-Day. The crisis point was in 1943. At that time, the Germans were winning. It looked as if we would have to abandon strategic daylight bombing and the point-blank campaign because our casualty rates were so high. The whole point of point blank was to clear the skies over occupied France of all warplanes by D-Day. The directive was obeyed. The operation succeeded, and there were nearly no Nazi planes overhead by D-Day. Landing on Omaha Beach was hard enough. Had there been swarms of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs opposing the landings too, we might well have been thrown back into the sea. In 1943, the Germans had transferred many of their best pilots from the Eastern Front to oppose the American daylight bombers. Remember, the British wouldn't fly in daylight over Germany at all because it was too dangerous. Churchill had tried to talk Eisenhower out of our high-altitude daylight precision bombing. But the Tuskegee Airmen didn't begin to escort our bombers until after D-Day, when the crisis point in the air war was well past. By the time the Red Tails went on escort duty, it was more of a mop-up operation. It was still dangerous, but not nearly as dangerous as it had been a year earlier when all the pilots were white. By the time the black pilots got into bomber escort, the German air opposition had been seriously worn down. Many of the experienced Nazi aces from the Eastern Front were now dead and replaced by barely trained rookie pilots. Because of the oil field raids, Germany didn't have enough aviation gas for training new pilots. Some Nazi pilots soloed for the first time in a combat mission. In the Battle of Britain, at the beginning of the war, the Nazis gave their pilots 250 hours of training. The RAF at that time gave 220 hours of training. The Germans were the best trained fighter pilots. But after D-Day, the Nazis could only afford 120 hours for new fighter pilots, while Americans got 400 hours. In those 1943 Schweinfurt raids, the year before the black pilots arrived, our bombers were met at the German border by more than 300 Nazi fighter planes. It was not like that for the Tuskegee Airmen. The 332nd Fighter Group, the Tuskegee Airmen, flew 311 missions. 179 of those were bomber escort missions, and on the vast majority of those escort missions, they never encountered a single German fighter. They flew into Germany unopposed on 146 missions. The Tuskegee Airmen never faced Germany's best. They didn't shoot down many Nazis, and they didn't lose many American bombers. Most of the time, they never saw a single German plane. And for some mysterious reason, probably political, the black pilots were spared the more dangerous free escort policies that came into being in 1944. They alone were allowed to stay near the bombers. Their job was to drive off the Nazi fighter planes, whereas the white pilot's job was to engage and kill the Nazi fighter planes. That's why the Tuskegee groups lost fewer bombers, were more popular bomber pilots, and killed so few enemy fighters. The Tuskegee Airmen were flying escort under different rules, which better protected the bomber crews and better protected them too. The Navy, didn't let blacks in combat at this time, and the American infantry didn't admit blacks until after the Battle of the Bulge. Blacks served in service units. The Army Air Corps seemed to likewise have shielded the Tuskegee Airmen from the most dangerous assignments, and the white bomber pilots seem to have noticed. But this has all been covered up for so long, it will take a better historian than I am to uncover all the truth. Are blacks capable of being good pilots? Yes. In fact, I'll argue that blacks are likely to be better fighter pilots than whites. That means that had I been one of those B-17 or B-24 setting out to drop bombs deep in Germany, I would have welcomed an escort of black fighter pilots. The Air Force doesn't have many black pilots these days. Blacks are underrepresented in the officer ranks in all branches of the military today. They're also underrepresented in elite groups like the Special Forces and the Navy SEALs. Why should that be? One reason is that the Air Force requires officers to be good at math and science. All the armed forces today use IQ tests. Since blacks are much less good than either whites or Asians at all academic subjects, it is not surprising that few blacks today make it into the air. The Air Force officers qualifying test isn't particularly difficult or unusual. Most of it is similar to the SAT. It also has a couple sections on aircraft-specific topics. You need to be able to read a plane's instrument panel, for example. But otherwise, it's much like the standard SAT or ACT tests that everyone takes to get into college. But not everyone does equally well on these tests. Blacks score a full standard deviation lower on all such intellectual aptitude tests. So does being smart make you a better fighter pilot? Nope. This question has been studied by the Navy and the Air Force for more than 70 years. I myself was a paid test subject for this in college. The results of all this work were published by Wigdor and Green in the 90s. Fighter pilot performance is not related to intelligence. The Air Force wants smart officers, but there is no evidence that being smart makes you a better fighter pilot. There is a lot of evidence, however, that good eyesight is important. The Air Force today requires pilots to have 27 vision uncorrected. Blacks have much better eyes than whites, and so should be, all other things being equal, better fighter pilots. Young black American men have myopia rates half that of whites. That's a huge difference. It's probably a bigger genetic advantage than that which blacks enjoy on the basketball court. Myopia, nearsightedness, is correlated with IQ. Myopia is caused in part by big eyeballs. Intelligence is caused in part by big brains. The same genes seem to cause both. Other groups that have high intelligence also have bad eyes. Jews and Orientals more often need glasses than do European-descended whites. Blacks have better eyes and smaller brains. That seems to be a pretty good combination for the job of fighter pilot. But what about other characteristics that fighter pilots need besides eyesight? What about character? The Air Force website suggests that fighter pilots need a lot of self-confidence. As it happens, blacks score high on all personality tests for self-esteem and self-confidence. This is a very consistent finding in many large-scale surveys with tens of thousands of participants and many different psychological instruments like the Sorensen test or the Minnesota multiphasic. Blacks probably have a better personality profile for the job of fighter pilot than whites. Blacks definitely have better eyes. Lucas tells a sanctimonious morality tale about equality. But black fighter pilots aren't just equal. They're probably superior. Oddly enough, though, none of this matters. The Air Corps in the 20s got it all wrong, and many people today misunderstand the logic of selection. Whites as a population are smarter, and blacks as a population have better eyes. But if you select a small group for intelligence and eyesight, those selected will all be more or less equal. The Tuskegee Airmen and the white pilots all took the same tests, so they had pretty much the same IQs and eyesight. A higher proportion of blacks probably couldn't get in because of IQ, and a higher proportion of whites probably couldn't get in because of poor eyesight. But there were no stupid, weak-eyed pilots of either color allowed into air combat. Remember, there were only about 1,000 Tuskegee Airmen. There were 2.5 million blacks in the draft. The Tuskegee pilots were a tiny black elite. At a time when most Americans didn't have a high school diploma, they were all college graduates. Why would anyone be surprised that they did okay? They were brave and they were skilled, but they were not representative of blacks in general or even blacks in the Army. 66 Tuskegee Airmen died in combat. Not a particularly high number, and certainly much lower than the death rate for blacks in mutinies and riots. Civil rights advocates today claim that 1,200 black soldiers were killed in the Camp Van Horn mutiny alone. The Tuskegee Airmen story is a celebratory legend, not about the war, its heroes, or the defeat of fascism. It is the triumph over domestic racial segregation. But there is another side to this story. The real key to winning the Second World War was probably the city of Detroit, the arsenal of democracy. That arsenal city was desegregated, and desegregation seems to have destroyed it. George Lucas is unlikely to make a movie about that story. Thanks for your attention. Please watch again next week.
Heimelig som du kan, le soir von der Bar.